All right, folks. So we are beginning class number 4 of the 13 principles, and a big thank you to Marky Mark, whose last name shall remain nameless, for setting up the live feed here on Facebook. Very exciting to be doing that for the first time. And a big welcome to Uncle Ellie, who's here with us, all the way from Maryland. Glad to have you. So we are in class number 4 of the 13 principles of faith. We have successfully gone through the first 5 principles, which we did last week. The first 2 classes were more of an introductory nature. Now we're actually going to be getting into the second part of the 13 principles. And welcome, Igor Reutberg. Glad to see you're listening over there in Frisco.
Really?
This is very fun for me. Very fun. Sam Blumen's on? All right. Perfect. Thank you, Sam. Anyways, the 13 principles we are now going to be going into is the second half of... That doesn't make sense. You can't say the second half. We are in the halfway mark. You have the first 5 principles of the Torah, which deal with the nature of God. You have the second half, which deal with the nature of Torah. And then you have the last part of the 13 principles, the last 4, which deal with the nature of reward and punishment. Tonight we're going to be going into the middle part, which deals with Torah. And this is an incredibly important part of the 13 principles. Of course, the validity of prophecy and Torah is an essential part of Judaism. If you don't really understand that, you have a very, very limited version of Judaism, and of course, a corrupt version of Judaism, as we'll see. These 13 principles, if you don't have them, Maimonidies says, you haven't built the kind of relationship with God necessary to be able to have a place in the world to come. So this information is primary to building a relationship with God. So just with that, let's jump into it. Page 178, we are in the 13 principles in the Art Scroll Siddur. If you have it with you, you can take it out. And we're going to take a look tonight at principle number 6. Principle number 6 is the beginning of the second portion of the 13 principles, which deals with prophecy and Torah. So let's jump right into it right now. The 6th principle of the 13 principles of faith, Ani mamin be'emunah shlema, I believe with a perfect faith, Shekol divrei neviim emes, I believe with a perfect faith that all the words of the prophets are true. All the words of the prophets are true. So let's talk a little bit about why this is so important. So the first thing that's important for us to point out is that what's clear from this statement is that without prophecy, there would be no way of us knowing God's will. Without prophecy, there would be no way of us knowing God's will. We can't assume it. Last time we spoke about the nature of relative ethics, and we know the way relative ethics go. Everybody has their own opinion, and 1,000 times over, something might be condemned and at the same time accepted or condoned by different people. One person can say abortion is a mitzvah. One person can say abortion is murder. One person can say that killing an infidel is a mitzvah, and another person can say, of course, that's the most heinous crime that there is. So relative ethics are very, very dangerous. If we leave it up to our own decision-making power, we know where that goes. Hitler had his own ethical system. Jewish people have their own ethical system. Buddhists have their own ethical system. There's nothing innate in nature which tells us exactly what ethics is. And therefore, if left up to each and every person's individual decision-making process, it's a very, very dangerous game to play where you're going to get a lot of different approaches. So what we learn here in number 6, Shekol divrei neviim emes, all the words of the prophets are true, is that it's important to know that number 1, there's prophecy, and number 2, that God gives over his will to man through prophecy. Because without that, we would have no way of knowing what his will is. Now, it's significant to point out that Maimonides calls this prophecy, not inspiration. Why is it important that the Maimonides calls this prophecy versus inspiration? Maybe the prophets, or well, we won't call them prophets, we would call them what? what would be a better word if they weren't actually prophesying? They were just inspired. What would we call them? Little motivational speakers, or maybe Tony Robbins, or little Da Vinci's. I don't know what we would call them. People that were inspired by God. You hear a lot of people talk about being inspired by God. Many of them we put into institutions. We put them into institutions. But these people in the past, the Torah calls them prophets, not people that were inspired. Why is that so important? Yeah.
Because inspiration is open to interpretation.
Okay, very good. Inspiration is open to interpretation. That's one reason. It's not clear. What's another reason?
Well, inspired is it hints that it's not a direct transfer of message.
Very good. Inspired means it's not a direct transfer of message. That's similar to what Schiffer said. It's not a clear message.
It's not communication.
It's not communication.
I mean, yeah, with inspiration, you can miscommunicate the message. Basically, like if you can receive the message, but you might mistranslate it.
Okay,
misrepresent it.
Okay, we could get the message and not know exactly how to interpret it correctly? Is that what you're saying?
Right.
There's also a separate issue. If I claim to be inspired by God, how do I know whether that's truly from God or whether it's me inspiring myself and assuming that it's God? How do I know where the inspiration's coming from? I might think it's coming from God, but really it's coming from Yogi Robkin. I watched a great movie last night, and suddenly I've got all these thoughts of sci-fi in my head, and aliens coming down, and God is speaking to me, and now I have a new religion. I'm a yogi. Oh, wait a minute. Well, again, inspiration is open to interpretation. Am I truly inspired by God? Like the writings in the Torah, which are divinely inspired? Or is this me thinking that I'm inspired by God? There's no way of really knowing. If we want an absolute source telling us that the Torah is from God, if we want to know exactly what God's will is in the world, we can't leave that to something which we can second guess. If I'm inspired and I claim to be inspired, I'm always going to leave that up to people second guessing. Was I truly inspired by God or was it really yogi? To be able to have a Torah that's truly meaningful and a Torah that binds man, it has to be absolute. And the moment that it's just inspiration, it's not absolute. I can always think that it's really the person themselves and not actually God communicating with them. See, the difference between inspiration and prophecy, even when it's actually from God, inspiration guides us. Prophecy provides a very clear message. And when we're talking about a relationship with God, we don't just want guidance, we want clarity. And if we want clarity, then we need God to clearly communicate to us exactly what his will is. That is principle number 6, that there's a concept that God communicates with man and that the Jewish prophets are true. We'll get a little bit later to how we know, how do we vet them out and make sure which prophets are false and which ones are true. We'll get to that a little bit later. But this principle is telling us prophecy is real, God does communicate with man, and not only that, the Jewish prophets are in fact true. So that's the difference between prophecy and inspiration. There are groups of Jewish people, there are groups within Judaism that change this concept and say that no, the Torah is not actually from God directly. There's not direct communication, but rather it is divinely, you may have heard it, divinely inspired. How many of you have heard of that term? It's divinely inspired. Okay, for those of you watching on Facebook, which I see a lot of people in there, many of us have heard of it. Probably you've heard of it. A lot of people in this room raised their hand. If you're watching it, you're probably raising your hand. Many of us have heard of this concept of people claiming that the Torah is not actually from God. It's not directly from God. It's just divinely inspired. The problem, again, is the difference between inspiration and the difference between prophecy. See, if something is divinely inspired, if we think that the Torah is divinely inspired, what it does, although those who profess it might not realize it, is it depletes the Torah of its authority and doesn't command the kind of respect necessary to bind somebody. Imagine the things that the Torah requires of us. God tells us don't work on Shabbos. Don't work every seventh day. It's a very hard thing to tell a person in retail. How do you tell a person in retail? I speak with people all the time. They tell me, Rabbi, I'd love to keep the Shabbos, but I'm in retail. Retail's open by definition. Saturday is the best day, right? That is the day when I sell most of my goods. If I don't come in on, you remember the famous line from The Simpsons? Where Homer's boss tells him, if you don't come in on Friday, don't bother coming in on Monday. And Homer says, woohoo, 4-day weekend. You remember that? Okay? Not all of us. Shabbos is God giving us a big challenge. And many religious Jews in the earlier part of the century, especially during the Great Depression, if you didn't come to work on Saturday, you had to get a new job the next week. And many of us have stories in our families where we can actually look back, and we had experiences within our own families where that was the reality. They didn't come in on Saturday, they had to look for a new job the next week. In fact, many religious Jews became business owners solely for the reason that they needed to be able to control their hours and they couldn't otherwise. God gives us a lot of very difficult commandments. Circumcise your sons. Not easy. Especially if you live in communist Russia. Gives us a lot of commandments. Take off for the holidays. Doesn't matter whether it's easy or not. Doesn't matter what your boss says. Keep kosher, even if you're in Botswana. No bushmeat for you. Okay? Very difficult. Very, very difficult. What is going to bind us to this set of incredibly detailed moral laws? What's going to bind us? Only if we see the Torah as absolute, as prophetic, and not divinely inspired. If it's prophetic, it is what it is. It's straight from God's mouth. I can't question it. I can't change it. It doesn't evolve over time. But the moment you say it's divinely inspired, everything changes. Because see, what happens is that the Torah very quickly becomes malleable. We start messing with it, tinkering with it. It's divinely inspired. It's not exactly from God. I can tinker with it. I can change it. We can evolve it as times change.
And that's the problem with the Reform movement?
Well, and slowly but surely, you don't have the same Torah that our grandparents had. Certainly you don't have the same Torah that Moses gave. It changes and changes and changes until it's a shadow of its original self. And we see that in many different sectors of Judaism where our grandparents wouldn't even recognize it as the Judaism of their youth. And that is because these movements, which see the Torah not as absolute, not as direct prophecy from God, but rather as divinely inspired, it encourages us to tinker. It tells us, just as they were inspired, why can't I be inspired? And my inspiration might look a little different than the older inspiration. That law is antiquated. That law isn't meant for nowadays. Of course, we need to evolve and adapt. And again, the Torah becomes very malleable. And here's the problem. When there's room for change, man's priorities and convenience tend to dominate the conversation. We don't recognize why we're changing parts of the Torah that we're changing, but subconsciously we always are going to look for that which is most convenient, that which serves our priorities best. And it's not necessarily always, so to speak, for the sake of heaven. I saw a beautiful quote about this, and it says that what ends up happening is that a person becomes a servant of himself rather than a servant of his Creator. When the Torah becomes something that you can adapt, you end up using the Torah to justify your own values, not necessarily the Torah's values, and you end up serving yourself rather than your Creator. So that is principle number 6, the first of the 4 principles which we're going to talk about tonight. Shekol divrei hanavim emes, all the words of the prophets are true, which tells us, number 1, God communicates with man. Number 2, without prophecy, we would not be able on our own to uncover, to discover what God's will truly is. And third of all, it's absolute. Inspiration is a guide. It gives us a sense of what God wants, but it's not absolute. Prophecy is a clear message. It's absolute. It's what God wants us to do. It doesn't change. So that is number 6. Let's take a look at number 7. Number 7, on page 178 here in the 13 Principles of Faith. Ani mamin be'emunah shlema. I believe with a perfect faith. Shenevuas Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom haisa amitis. I believe with a perfect faith that the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophecy of Moses, was true, v'shehu haya av l'neviim, and that he was the father of all the rest of the prophets, lakod min lefanav, those prophets that preceded him. Right? Who's a prophet that preceded Moses? Abraham. Who else? Sarah. Very good. They're married. Little nepotism, never heard. Who else? Adam. Our good buddy. Noah. Shem. Aver. Yaakov. Yitzchak. Rachel. Leah. Okay, Yosef. We have a lot of people that were prophets. A lot of people that were prophets. Was Yosef a prophet? I'm not sure if Yosef ever actually received prophecy. We'll have to look into that. But Moshe Rabbeinu, this principle tells us, was the father of all of the rest of the prophets, the ones that preceded him and the ones that followed him. Who were some prophets that followed him? Isaiah. Who else? Joshua, Yoshua, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel. There's a load of different prophets. So that's principle number 7, that the prophecy of Moses was true, and that he was the father of all the prophets, the ones that preceded him, and the ones that followed him. Now here's the question, of course, that needs to be asked. What does it mean that Moses was the father of the prophets? Did he give birth to Abraham? It would be very, very difficult to imagine that. I don't know. I'm trying to think of some sci-fi way of imagining how Moses could give birth to Abraham, who preceded him by a number of years. Did Moses give birth to Isaiah?
Well, it's kind of like
that comes way after
the Terminator, where the sun goes back in time.
Oh my gosh! Don't start pulling out the Terminator here. Okay. Boy, my mind is already blown. I don't even know where to go with that. So, what does it mean that Moses is the father of all these prophets? Of course, it's not meant literally. He didn't birth them. So what do you think it means? What does it mean that Moses was the father of all the prophets? What does it mean that Moses is the father of all the prophets?
And I think more importantly, the significance, because there wouldn't be one of these principles if it wasn't...
Right, and why is this so central? Why is this the kind of a principle that if I don't know this, I can't develop the right relationship with God necessary to have a place in the world to come?
Because he received the Torah.
What? He received the Torah? Okay. What does it mean that he's the father of all the prophets? What do you think that means? I'll tell you what I always thought it meant, and I'll tell you a brand new interpretation, which I think is mind-blowing, even more mind-blowing than the Terminator analogy. Or the Matrix. Don't even pull out the Matrix. Okay. I always thought when it says that Moses is the father of all the prophets, you know what it meant? He's the top one. He's the big dog. He is the prophet who was closest to God, got the most direct prophecy from God. Like, for example, it says in the Talmud, and we'll discuss a little bit later, that Moses had a relationship with God which was called Aspaklaria de Meira, which was an incredible clarity, his relationship between himself and God, that God spoke and Moses heard, like me and you are speaking over Facebook, that close. That close of a relationship, even closer, there was no screen. There was no screen. So other prophets we'll talk about later in a different principle, the principle which talks about the difference between Moses and the other prophets. Actually, it's let's see here. Well, this is basically it. Yeah. We'll talk about the difference between Moses and other prophets a little bit later. But I always thought it meant he's the father of all the prophets. He's the most important prophet. His prophecy was the most clear, whereas the other prophets had prophecy while in dream states or in trances, at night, out of their control, their bodies failed them. Moses spoke to God like you and I would speak across from the table, peh el peh, adabrabo, mouth to mouth. I spoke with him. And that's what it means he was the father of all other prophets. That's what it means he was the father of all other prophets. He was the greatest prophet.
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that when you say, the father of cognitive therapy, that's Aaron Beck. It doesn't mean that the other psychologists weren't as great as he was. It just means that he laid the foundation.
It means that Moses laid the foundation.
Yes.
Very good, Sabrina. Excellent. Moses laid the foundation, and that's actually what we're going to say. Did you cheat? Did you use Facebook and use the live feed to go back in time and see what I was going to say? This is really blowing my mind. Okay. So I wouldn't put it past Sabrina. She's pretty special. Let me give a little background to this answer and expound upon what Sabrina's saying. Let me tell you a very interesting story which has been told in Jewish circles for many years. It's a story about a grand Rebbe. Let's call him the Plano Rebbe. The Plano, we're in Plano. If nobody got it. The Planische Rebbe. Okay. This Planische Rebbe had lots of Hasidim. Okay, he had lots of Hasidis. He had Umpa, he had Lumpa. He had, what are the little minion fellows called? He had Ba, Na, Na, and Na. He had all these different Hasidim all around him, hundreds and thousands of Hasidim, and the Rebbe dies, leaving his community bereft of leadership. And who's going to lead? Who's going to be the next Rebbe? Who's it going to be? The Rebbe has two sons. Let's call them Yankel and Fred. We're always bringing Fred back into the conversation. Yankel and Fred. Fred, of course, was the slow one. Yankel and Fred. And and they don't know, of course the community doesn't know, who is going to be the next Rebbe. Who did the father want? So weeks go by and nobody knows what to do. And finally, in the morning, Yankel, the eldest, the wisest, gets up in the shul, in the middle of the shul, and he claps on the bima. I have a very important announcement to make. I want everybody to know. My father, Papa, your beloved Rebbe, came to me in a dream and told me that I am to be the next Planische Rebbe. It's going to be me. And everyone, there's a buzz that enters the room. This is very exciting, a prophecy, some type of prophetic dream that Yankel had in the middle of the night. Maybe he drank too much caffeine the night before. Maybe it was the secret cholent recipe. Nobody knows exactly what caused. Maybe it was really true. Maybe it was true. An old man stands up in the back of the room and he says, "Excuse me, if the Rebbe, your father, truly wanted us to know that you were to be the next Rebbe, he wouldn't have come to you in a dream. He would have come to all of us in a dream. Because if he came to us in a dream, we have no bias. We have no reason to make up that we had a dream that you're going to be our next leader. We have no skin in the game. But if you say that he came to you, well, how incredibly convenient. Next thing we know, Fred's going to have a dream. I have a dream." And the Rebbe came to him. So this is the fundamental difference between the mass revelation at Sinai and every other religion in the world. Throughout the history of the world, thousands upon thousands of different religions. And no one has a story, a Masorah, a tradition, that God didn't come down to the leader and say, "You're a prophet," but rather came to the congregation and said, "He's my prophet." One case in the entire history of the world, of what we know in known history, written history. The only recorded case of a mass revelation where God came down to an entire people and said, "Moshe, he's my man. He is my true prophet. You can trust what he's saying." And they heard him at Mount Sinai saying the first two of the Ten Commandments, and they heard Moshe, come up to the mountain and hear what I have to say. The only recorded case of a mass revelation is the Torah. The only case that, like the example of the Rebbes and the sons, where God came to the congregation, not to the leader. This is what it means in Deuteronomy, when it says in chapter 4, verse 32, "Ki sha'al na liyamim rishonim asher hayu lefanecha." When you will go and ask about all of written history, "Limin hayom asher bar Elokim adam ala aretz," from all the first time the man was created on earth, Ulemiktei hashamayim vad kitzei hashamayim, from one edge of the earth to the other end of the earth. Haniyeh kadavar hagadol hazeh, has there ever been such a great thing like this Sinai experience? O anishma kamo, has anyone heard of such a story told? Hashama am kol elokim, that an entire nation should hear the words of God, mitaber mitoch ha'esh, speaking from inside of the heavenly fire, kasher shamata ata v'yechi, like you in fact heard, and you lived to talk about it? Do you know I did research, by the way, to see if this was in fact true? Was there actually no recorded case of any religion claiming to have a mass revelation where God actually came to the people, not to the leader? Do you know how many cases I found? A big goose egg. 0. There was one case of Indians who said that in the midst of a war battle, God came to them, whatever their Indian god was, and revealed himself to them, but then they all died and they couldn't tell anyone about it. So in other words, back to square one. It only matters if you live to tell about it. And that's very interestingly, I think, why the Torah says about it in that verse, that the whole nation has heard the word of God, kasher shamata ata vayechi, and you lived to tell it. Anybody can make up a story that their grandparents heard it, but then they died. Nobody from that prophecy was able to share it with their children. But with the Torah, they lived to tell about it. They lived and they told their children, and they did a Pesach Seder, and they said, remember when we were at Sinai, and then their children said, remember when Zeta was at Sinai, and then later on our ancestors were at Sinai. We have an unbroken chain. No other case in recorded history. None. Every religion follows the same, what I would call religious narrative. Every single one of them. You can think of any religion you want to, and it follows the same religious narrative as to how it discovered the truth. Let's give a few examples of this. And by the way, out of 165 religious families, you'll see it's all the same. Let's start with our good friends, because of course they're very popular here in the Western world. Christianity. Christianity, a nice Jewish religion, at least in its origins, started by a Jew, primarily a man named Shaul, otherwise known as, who knows what his English name was? Shaul. Paul. Oh. Okay? Paul, he's on the road to Damascus. I'm on the road to Damascus. 35 years after Jesus dies. And Jesus reveals himself to him on the road. He tells him about the miracles that he wrought, and at that moment, he converts. He becomes a Christian. And he tells everybody about his experience. Paul ends up writing approximately half of what becomes the New Testament. The Pauline documents, these different documents that Paul wrote, are in circulation from around 65 CE to 325 CE, until around 325 CE, when the Council of Nicaea finally puts all of these different documents together and forms it into what we now call the New Testament, and of course modern Christianity is born. Who saw Jesus? Who knows about his miracles? Who spread the miracles that Jesus did? Paul, 35 years after Jesus had died. In other words, is it true or is it not true? Is it true or is it not true?
Only Paul knows.
Well, only Paul knows. It could be that Paul's a truth seeker, and he would never lie to us, and Paul is just Paul the Saint. St. Paul. Sounds like a good city in Minneapolis.
Or he could have been walking down the road.
Or he could have been in Colorado, had a little bit of the forbidden fruit brownie.
I was thinking the
mushrooms on the Palestine peyote. Well, Palestine peyote, I like that. And seen something. By the way, I actually looked into it to see exactly how the verse is written in Acts. It's in Acts, not part of the Jewish Bible. It's in Acts chapter 9, verse 4 through 7. Paul sees a light and he hears a voice, and there were men with him. They also hear a loud sound, but they don't see anything. Magically, only Paul has night vision. Jesus vision. Only Paul sees Jesus. And that's where Christianity comes from. One man, 35 years later. Islam. Muhammad hears voices in his head. That's the way the Quran says it. Which he thought were from God. And he has these statements written down by a scribe, because as if you'll ask any good Muslim, they'll tell you Muhammad was illiterate. So he has his scribe write it down on whatever they could find, bones, shards of pottery, whatever they had, until finally it gets turned into surahs, and then it becomes the Quran. But again, Muhammad is the one who hears the voices. Is it true? Well, I can't tell you for sure that it's not true. But can I tell you that it's true? Absolutely not. I would have to believe Muhammad. I don't know Muhammad. And even if I knew Muhammad, I would be quicker to send him to a psych ward than I would to assume that he was a prophet from God. By the way, not that Muhammad's any different than any other prophet. If I heard some individuals say that they had prophecy from God and only they knew about it, I would say that's very nice. I hope you live a nice life and live according to those messages from God. But if God wants me to follow you, he'll come and tell me. Just like the story of the two Rebbes. Same thing with Buddhism, with Siddhartha Gautama, sitting under the Bodhi tree, and he launches Buddhism, ascends to the 8th stage of transic insight, comes to learn about all there is in the world, comes back to his body, 45 years of being a leader and a teacher. Again, could Siddhartha have achieved this 8th stage of transic insight? Certainly possible, but I'm not going to live my life based on Siddhartha in India. Because again, I just don't know. I have no way of corroborating or verifying that Siddhartha is telling the truth. I just don't know. It's not meaningful to me. Same thing with Mormonism. Our good buddy Joseph Smith, who's on a hike, and he finds golden tablets from a language that we've never known about called Reformed Egyptian. And magically, the dictionary from Reformed Egyptian to English right next to it. And then he goes about translating that, which becomes the Book of Mormon. And then, of course, he smashes the golden tablets, because who needs golden tablets anyways? I mean, they're just golden tablets that only exist once in a lifetime. And between him and his partner, Oliver Cowdery, they have regular revelations, which becomes Doctrines and Covenants of the Mormon Church, and the Church of Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ is born. And again, is it true? Is it not true? I don't know. From an academic perspective, the credibility level is 0. And here's where Judaism is different. Because, of course, Judaism doesn't talk about one person getting a prophecy. It talks about the whole nation getting a prophecy. It's a fundamentally different experience. Fundamentally different experience. But of course the Torah starts the same way. Abraham, singular prophet, who says that God spoke with him. Again, I'll put Abraham with Muhammad or Jesus or Joseph Smith or Siddhartha. Doesn't really matter. A singular prophet claiming to be true. Then comes Yitzchak, then Yaakov. Okay, they get it. Of course, before that you have Adam and you have other prophets before that. But they're all individual prophets. Nobody hears God speaking to Abraham. That follows the regular religious narrative of every other religion. So if I had a religion called Abrahamism, I would say put that up there with Christianity. Abraham says he's a prophet from God. I can't prove it. I can't disprove it. That's all it is. What's different about Judaism? You had a question?
No, I was going to say that Avraham never claimed to be a prophet.
What does that mean he didn't claim to be a prophet?
He didn't. Avraham came to the realization of God on his own.
Right.
For himself.
At the beginning, he discovers him on his own.
He discovered it on his own. And then he brought it to the attention of his father.
Right.
Right. That's the first story, obviously, with smashing the idols and the whole thing. He said to his father, how is this possible? And his father says, I made those things. Of course it's not possible. Right. So this is a realization. This is him coming to a level on his own of seeing God in the world.
But what happens when he's 99?
No.
But when he's 99, he becomes a prophet.
Right.
And God tells him, I'm with you. Circumcise yourself. Go bring your son later up. Right. Go bring him and make a barbecue of.
Right. But all the things, the difference between the two, is that all of the things that God spoke to Avram about, pertain to him alone.
right. You're saying You're saying Abraham is not going out and missionizing Abrahamic, although he does. No, he try to reach out for monotheism, but
right. He was reaching out for monotheism for people to come to it.
But he's not trying to be the leader of a new religion.
Exactly.
There certainly are differences between Abraham and other prophets. But at the end of the day, if I had a religious teaching which was based on Abraham, it would be no different than the religious narrative of Christianity, Islam, Mormonism, Buddhism, Taoism, Scientology. That's even worse. L. Ron Hubbard, a sci-fi writer who becomes a head of a religion.
I'm saying the majority of Jewish prophets in general never wanted to be prophets.
Well, that is true. There's certainly...
It's just a very different approach, I'm saying.
Right.
Most prophets want to say, hey, I heard God's word, here's God's word, follow me.
Right.
But Jewish prophets don't say
There's
that.
no question Jewish prophets are fundamentally different in the sense that they're not there for self-aggrandizement. They're not there trying to put themselves on a pedestal to somehow benefit from it or to be the heads of a new church or a new religion. There's no question they're there just to do good. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why certainly post-Moshe, which we'll talk about, we can look back and say, yeah, those were certainly true prophets. But what I'm trying to say is if the religion was just based on Abraham saying, I'm a prophet, even if he was somehow fundamentally different than all other prophets, it would still have zero academic credibility because just me telling you I'm a prophet.
Right.
All right, so let's go from there. So, of course, Judaism is different in the sense that there's an exodus and 3 million people stand at the foot of Mount Sinai and experience God. Now, if you asked an academic from university, they would say, you think that's a difference between Judaism and all other religions? You're fooling yourself. Because who do you think wrote the Torah? It wasn't Moses at Mount Sinai with 3 million people. It was 4 people, JEPD, and then finally R for redactor. Now, this isn't a class on biblical criticism. I gave a class on biblical criticism a few months ago. Anybody who's interested, I can teach a class down the road more on the way that universities study the Bible with biblical criticism based on the idea of multiple authorship of the Torah. But suffice it to say, they believe that there were 4 authors of the Torah. J, which stands for Jehovah. One source that they say wrote the Torah with the name Hashem, Jehovah. Another person wrote it with the name E. He's the E source, Elohim. Then there was the P source, which is the priestly document, mostly in Vayikra and Leviticus, because they believed, academic scholars believe that there was a source that was primarily interested in priestly law. And finally you have D, which is Deuteronomy, which, by the way, I always tell people, that is the only one that Orthodox Judaism will agree there was a different author for. There actually was a D. There was a D. Because who is D? Who wrote Deuteronomy? Moses. That's why it's written in the first person. Moses talks about I, whereas the rest of the time in the Torah it says God told Moses. So D is the only source that we agree with biblical criticism. And then finally you have a redactor that comes sometime later, takes these different composite sources, JEPD, puts them together into what we now know as our canonized Torah, and that's what we have. So, in other words, if you told an academic Judaism is fundamentally different because it has this mass revelation, they would say, well, that's very nice, but we don't have that tradition from the people that experienced it themselves. We have these various sources that got compiled later on in history by one person, the redactor. So the redactor becomes the Paul figure, the redactor becomes the Mohammed figure, the Joseph Smith figure, the Siddhartha figure, this redactor, whoever this redactor is. And so again, Judaism falls back to square one if you have a redactor figure. So that's, of course, the argument that academics will tell us about the reason why Judaism is not really different in this paradigm. But we have to be empiricists about this, not really worrying about theoretical realities. We need to actually look into this and say what actually seems more probable. Let's talk about that for just a little bit. So imagine you have a redactor. Let's call him, don't say it. Don't say it. Don't say Fred. Ed! Now we're talking. We have a redactor named Ed. Now, there are 3 possibilities for where Ed can place the Mount Sinai experience. Past, it happened in the past. or it happened in the present, it happened to you who's in front of me, you just don't realize it, or in the future. So these are three different ways of this redactor placing the Sinai event. So let's start with the easiest, the present theory. I am Yogi. Welcome to my feed. God also gave me a feed.
It's a future 20 seconds.
Okay, a live feed. Right now, we're actually talking. As I'm talking to you, I'm also getting divine messages. And actually, I just want you to know, right now, we are all of us here in this world, all the Jewish people here together, we are experiencing a divine revelation. God is speaking to all of us right now. Can't you hear it? Can you see the fire? Can you hear the lightning? Can you see the... No, not see the lightning. No, in the Torah it says that our senses were mixed up, and we could see that which could only be heard and hear that which we could only see. Don't try to trick me here. Okay. So, can't you feel it? Can't you feel the love tonight? Okay. Can't you feel it right now? We're having this incredible Torah experience. We're having this Mount Sinai experience. Now, people are going to say to me, I can't feel it. I say, no, you're really feeling it. That's a very, very difficult tale to tell because you're right here. Very, very difficult to get away with the redactor saying it's happening right now. Let's talk about the future. Let's imagine we put it in the future. One day, I have a prophecy from God that one day we'll all stand at the foot of Mount Sinai and we will have this experience that's incredible and awesome, and God will come down to us and fireworks and, the most incredible spiritual experience of your life, and God will reveal himself to all of us, all 3 million of us, the whole Jewish people, and it's going to be life-changing. So let's take that opportunity. Maybe the redactor creates a prophecy that in the future it'll happen. Problem is, our tradition isn't based around a prophecy happening in the future. It's based around a prophecy that already occurred. And even if you want to say it started out as a future prophecy, eventually it would have to evolve into a past prophecy to work with our current way that we have Judaism. So that just goes back to the issue with the past. That just goes into the past theory. So past is really the only way that could possibly work. Okay. So past is really the only way that it could possibly work.
I'm sorry, I don't understand why I can't put your own.
Future, why doesn't future work?
Yeah.
Because when we celebrate Passover, the way we have Judaism today, we're not celebrating something which will happen. We're celebrating something which did happen. So if the redactor came and said the Mount Sinai event will happen, it doesn't fit with the way that we practice Judaism. Eventually, it would have to switch to it happened in the past. And so therefore, we'd have to really look into the past theory, which we haven't dealt with yet. We're just excluding future theory and present theory.
So what are we saying this redactor did this? I don't know.
Oh, so we're going to get to that. You're saying, I never heard about a redactor. Shifra's very bothered. I went to Beis Yaakov for 12 years, and they never taught me about a redactor.
No, I was like, what would we even say that he did this? Like, that's
Okay, well, in academic circles, they claim that there was a redactor who put these 4 different sources, J, E, P, and D, together and made the Torah that we have now. And basically the way that they work it is that there was this, there's 2 ways that it could possibly happen, but let's focus on the way that we're thinking about it now. That this redactor would claim like this. Let's use the past theory now. In the past, all of your ancestors got the Torah. But then something happened. We got kicked out of our land. There was anti-Semitism. There was terrible plagues. People died. Whatever happened. And there was a gap in history where all of your ancestors forgot about the Torah. This is the way if you wanted to make up Torah. Okay? There was a gap. And now I, the great redactor, am coming to bring back that which already happened. Who is that redactor? Different academics have different theories. Was it Ezra, who comes back from Babylon? Chizkiyahu, Yirmiyahu, lots of different theories about who this redactor was. Yeah. מה זה redactor? זה שאלה טובה.
מי שבא
מסדר את הכל.
מוחק כמה דברים ושם ביחד כמה דברים.
This is the belief that's found in universities, that the Torah wasn't given by Moses and passed down, that there were disparate different sources that were passed down in Jewish history, and eventually this redactor comes and puts them together. into one semi-cohesive document.
So according to that theory, Moses never got the Torah. It was just tradition.
This is this redactor trying to create a religion, just like Jesus or Muhammad would be trying to create a religion. Right, a ghostwriter. Okay. Right, an orech. That's a good way of putting it. So a person tries to reinstitute Judaism. So let me step back for just a moment and explain why the past theory is so tempting. Let me tell you why the past theory is so tempting. So there is a thing called the Applewhite theorem. Anybody heard of the Applewhite theorem? Okay. The Applewhite theorem, based on a person named Marshall Applewhite. Ever heard of the Heaven's Gate cult? You remember the Heaven's Gate cult?
Yep.
When was that?
Was it late 90s?
Late 90s? I don't know.
Midnight?
Anyways, this guy Marshall Applewhite in this really upscale city, Rancho Santa Fe, California. And he gets this group of very educated people to believe that the only way you can be saved is by going through Heaven's Gate. You remember this, when this happened, Heaven's Gate? They all died in the end. I'll sort of spoil it.
Spaceship behind the...
Not Hale-Bopp. What was it, Hale-Bopp?
They drank the Kool-Aid.
What was the one of the comet?
The spaceship on the comet that was going to save them?
Oh, was that Heaven's Gate? That was Heaven's Gate, yeah. Where the spaceship on the comet, you got to get onto the spaceship.
The comet was Hale-Bopp comet.
Hale-Bopp comet. Now we're talking. Okay, so what happens over here? So, first he tells them everybody needs to wear black Nikes to get onto the comet. Because they're very particular about dress code.
It was white Nikes.
Black Nikes.
Okay.
God forbid white Nikes. Go on a golf course with white Nikes. You don't go on the comet with white Nikes. Okay. And then he told some men to do some gruesome surgeries, which we won't talk about. And then finally he gathers them all in his palatial estate, and he says, I want everybody to take this lethal dose of phenobarbital and tie a plastic bag around your head, and bada bing, bada boom, you will go to Heaven's Gate. And 38 out of the 40 people in this cult end up dying. The other 2 were on their way that he couldn't make it. Unfortunately, they got delayed. They missed the flight. Now, what's fascinating is right near this city, Rancho Santa Fe, California, is the University of California of San Diego, one of the 2 places in the country which has a center for the study of cults. So they immediately sent out their graduate students to take pictures and study what had gone on there. And they interviewed the relatives of these people, and they said, wow, these people must have been crazy. And they actually found out none of them had mental illness. None of them had even been to a therapist in their lifetimes. And when they asked them what was the nature of these people, they said they were all healthy people until they got into the cult, and they went meshuggah. They went crazy. Now, what the Applewhite theorem teaches us is an incredible idea. 2 ideas. Number 1, people are gullible and will believe anything, even claims that require them to do self-destructive, even possibly suicidal things. That's number 1. People will believe anything, even to their own detriment. And number 2, as long as the claim cannot be checked. I can't check. I can't know if covering your head with a bag and killing yourself with a lethal dose of phenobarbital will put me on Hale-Bopp. So therefore, I can choose to believe it. But if it's something which can be checked, people won't believe it. So if I go with the present theory, and I'm this charismatic leader, and I say, the Torah was given to you now, I'm not going to be gullible because I'm going to check that. I would never believe it. But if I put the Sinai episode in the past, there's no way of me checking it. Now I could possibly believe it. And that is the reason why the past theory is so compelling. Because I could believe something that I can't verify. And so that is why the past theory is so compelling. We want to put it in the past. We want to put this redactor, this one who makes up Judaism, we want to make him put the Sinai event into the past. Now, here's the problem with this idea. What's the question?
Sorry, I'm confused by that because if you're telling me that it's like in the future, that we can't check.
No, you're right. The future I can't check either. But the problem with the future theory is that our whole system of Judaism is based on this idea that the Sinai event already happened. So although the future event is equally unverifiable, it doesn't fit with our Judaism.
But you think the past should be verifiable?
How can you verify the past? If this redactor claims there was a gap of knowledge and tradition, I can't verify it. This is before Rabbi Google. Okay, I can't verify it. So it's incredibly compelling. The Applewhite theory would tell me that a person could be gullible and believe anything. There are two basic problems, though, with this idea that the Torah was made up by some redactor or some person who we don't know who he is.
Wouldn't we have some way of tracing this time period where it lost?
So there's two very important issues with trying to place the Torah in the past, the Sinai event in the past, that this person is creating Judaism, like Muhammad would create Islam, or Jesus would, or Paul would create Christianity, or Siddhartha would create Buddhism. Okay, the same way there was some magical, mystical, hidden figure who we don't know about, who did the same with Judaism. So there's two problems.
Well,
the first,
right, because
yeah,
he's just the redactor. He's
well,
not the author, the actual.
Supposedly. Okay, either he did write it or he just compiled it. We'll get to the compiling issue, the idea of an evolving mythology in a little bit. But there's two basic problems. Number one, where is this gap?
Yeah.
We have a very strong Jewish history from Moshe to Joshua and on. And in fact, one of my teachers actually did this. He spent 2.5 years tracing back where his tradition came from his rabbi, and from his rabbi, and his rabbi to his rabbi, all the way back to Moses. Each one with 4 different outside documents verifying the existence of that person. So we don't have a significant gap. Only took him 2.5 years. We don't have this gap, this supposed gap, when the redactor could come in and say, there was a time between Moses and now that we lost it and I'm coming to bring it back. So we don't have such a gap. And the second problem is, who is this redactor? In all of Jewish history, in the Talmud, in the Torah, in the Midrash, we have absolutely no source that tells us about a redactor. If it's Ezra, if it's Chizkiah, if it's Yirmiyahu, nowhere in Jewish history do we have anything about this. We don't have any source that there was this person who compiled documents together. And by the way, when I was studying biblical criticism, I also wanted to see, do we have any documents that ever show low battery? Do we have any documents which show that that there were this J document or the E document or the P document or the D document separate from each other? Zero. We have no documents which are not our whole Torah. We don't have different documents which were supposedly written by different sources. It's all a theory, and a bad theory on top of that. When you study it and see how there are countless contradictions internally within the theory, but that's for a different class. So, number one, there's no gap, and number two, who's this great redactor? You would think we would know about him, even if he claimed not to be the head of the religion. But we should know that he was the great redactor who came. How do you hide that? How do you hide this great redactor? So and this is really just touching on it with a feather. There's so much to say about the problems with the past theory. But there isn't any way that the past theory works. So what comes out is that if the past theory doesn't work, the present theory doesn't work, and the future theory doesn't work, if none of those, I think it went on
Facebook doesn't work.
I just went on power saver about it. We'll go back.
Let's see. Turn battery saver on.
No. We'll have to work on this. If none of those theories work, turn off power saver, brother. If none of those theories work, then we have to say. If none of those theories work, then we have to say that the Torah is true. Now here's the other point. here's the other point, which, by the way, is very important. What is the basic axiom of history? What's the basic thing we know about history?
Repeats itself.
History repeats itself. We know that history repeats itself more than once. That's the background for all of the scientific theory, that if I have the same conditions, the same thing will happen over and over. Okay? That's the basic concept of science, and that's why you can test things. You can test scientific phenomena, because under the same conditions, I'll get the same result. How is it that in all of history, you only have a mass revelation one time? How's it possible? How's it possible? You have to understand, if you were creating a religion, there is nothing that would be more powerful for your religion than to have a mass prophecy where God comes down to man and tells him, it's me. There would be nothing more powerful for the spreading of your religion. And yet Judaism is the only example of that happening throughout history.
And that's the hardest thing to fake, too.
Right. And the reason why is because you can't fake it.
Right.
It doesn't work. You can't make this up. If it could be made up, religions would have done it over and over and over again. It's the best thing that a religion has going for it. To say, you don't have to trust me, trust you. And yet it only happens once in history. Anything natural should repeat itself multiple times, and yet it is a historical anomaly. God coming down in the form of a human being happens all the time in many religions. Right? A person getting an individual prophecy we have to trust happens all the time. And yet the most obvious thing, which would be most positive for spreading your religion, that God came down to you, not to me, only once. Crazy. It just doesn't make sense. And the reason is because you can't fib such a tale. It doesn't work. Eventually the story cracks. Somebody says, okay, this was made up, or my grandparents weren't there. It just doesn't work. Even in the past theory, it just doesn't work. And even if you were to come up and say, well, it works once every 5,000 years, and we just can't go far back enough in history because all the papyruses were, wiped out and all the cave drawings went bad. But really, it probably happened 10,000 years ago. Again, you have to ask yourself the question, is that really logical to say? Is that logical? Are you willing to stick your thumb out and say, that's why I'm not keeping Torah, because I believe it's so incredibly random? Again, very, very hard and not compelling argument. So, in the end of the day, Judaism and the Torah is very unique in the sense that it has this mass revelation which never ever repeats itself throughout history. And people might come and say, well, there are ways of explaining it. It didn't just get handed down by a redactor. It was an evolving mythology, right? It was something that happened over time. Again, the more simple the explanation you give for how the Torah got to us and still claimed a mass revelation is all the more reason why other religions should have copied it. The more simple the explanation about how it's possible that it could have happened, the more reason it should have happened a number of times. And yet it doesn't. So again, you see a guy rolling dice over and over and over, and he gets, double sixes each time. You can either assume that it's just incredibly lucky and just random, or you can say it's fixed. And in fact, that is what Judaism, of course, says, that it was fixed. Guess who fixed it? God's in on the fix. So this is really incredibly important. This is the idea of principle number 7, that the prophecy of Moshe is true. The prophecy of Moshe is true. Any questions, by the way, just from where we're up to?
Are you logged into his?
Any questions?
You have to be logged into his. Yeah. You know his password? You share everything, don't you?
Of course.
Of course.
Or you use the same password?
No.
Okay, let's talk just a little bit more just about the difference between Moshe and the other prophets. Let's talk a little bit more about the difference between Moshe and the other prophets. Does anybody know the differences between Moses' prophecy and everybody else's prophecy? Does anybody know the differences? What was that? God always talked to Moshe when he was awake. Okay, so there are a number of differences between Moshe's prophecy and other people's prophecy, the other prophets. Number one, the Talmud says that no two prophets have the same style. Anybody know what that means? No two prophets have the same style? What it basically means is that God comes to them in a dream, but it's not direct. He gives them a dream, and then he also gives the interpretation to that prophet. But the prophet, it's given to him in a way where he can interpret it in his own way. Don't worry about it, it's fine. It's given to him in a way where he can interpret in his own way, in his own voice. And that's why when you read the words of the prophets, each one speaks with their own unique voice. To Moshe, it's exactly word for word, straight from Hashem, straight from God. So that's one difference. Another difference between the two, anybody else know? What's another difference? The other prophets received their prophecy in a dream, and Moses got it awake, face to face. When other ones had their prophecy, they lost their strength. They had awesome fear. Moshe, he's completely fine with it. He doesn't get overwhelmed. Moshe's is word for word, where the other prophets are dream-like scenarios, or God's prophecy comes in a dream, and then they interpret it on their own. So the natural difference, by the way, the natural distinction between Moshe's prophecy and everybody else's is a very important distinction. Moshe's prophecy we know to be true. Every other prophet we only know to be true, like Sabrina said, because we know that Moshe is true. Do you see what I'm saying? We know that Moshe is true because we were there at Mount Sinai. And once we know that Moshe is true, what do we know? That the other prophets could potentially be true. Once we have one verifiable prophecy, I know that the other prophets are possibly telling the truth, because I have one case where I can verify that it's true. Do you see what I'm saying, Sabrina? So when it says in the principles that Moshe is the father of all other prophets, what it's really saying is that the credibility of all other prophets comes from the fact that Moshe's prophecy was validated. And since we know that Moshe's prophecy is true, we can now start knowing that other prophecies could also be true. Does this make sense? I'm not saying it so clearly. Ellie, does that make sense? Yeah. It makes sense? So that's what it means that Moshe is the father of all of the other prophets. Because we know that Moshe's prophecy is true, then we also can now, it lends credibility to other prophets. Do you see this? This is so important. That's the reason why it would be so absurd to consider any other prophet's claims if they proceed to contradict anything that Moses says. Aline, does that make sense? If you had a prophet that came and said, I'm getting a prophecy from God, and it's contradicting what Moses says, it would be ludicrous to consider it. Because the whole reason why this prophet has credibility is because we know that Moses gave a true prophecy, which we saw. So now we know prophecy is possible. We've verified it. So if that prophet goes and uses the credibility which comes from Moses' prophecy, and then goes and contradicts Moses' prophecy, it would be ludicrous. Because his entire credibility comes from Moses. Do you see this? And that's the reason why, as we'll get to in just a moment, the Torah can never be replaced by another Torah. Because if another person would come to us and say, God gave me a new Torah, I would say, he didn't give it to me the way he gave it at Sinai. So why in the world would I believe it? The source for your and every prophet's credibility comes from Moses' verifiable prophecy. See, so the moment that you undermine Moses is the moment you deny your prophecy. Does this make sense to everybody? Does this make sense? Yeah? Chaya? So that's basically what comes out from the fact of the uniqueness of Moshe's prophecy, is the fact that no prophet can ever contradict Moshe's prophecy, because he's the only verifiable prophecy. The only other prophecy that we might consider is another prophecy which is in line with Moses, doesn't contradict it, and fulfills what Moses' prophecy said about what a true prophet would be. And one of those things is you can't contradict Moses. You can't contradict the Torah, which we all got from God at Sinai. And the other thing that we learn from the fact that Moses' prophecy is unique is that Moshe's prophecy alone is called Torah. Anything else is just prophecy. That's why we have Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses. Then you have Nevi'im, prophets, and then you have Ketuvim. But we don't call what other prophets do Torah. Moses is alone in how unique his prophecy was. The other prophets just come to admonish people about the Torah, or to clarify what the Torah means, but never to give a new Torah, a contradictory Torah. Of course, they couldn't, because the moment that they do, it undermines the very credibility which they stand on, which is Moses' prophecy. So that is number 8. And of course, if we want to get close to God's will, and we want to get close to the knowledge of Hashem, it can only be through study of Torah, which God gave mouth to mouth from Moshe. Even more than studying the prophets, even more than studying the writings, more than anything, we come close to God by studying specifically the Torah, which was given directly from God. Let's take a look at principle number 8, and we'll try to move through these a little faster, because it's late. Ani mamin be'emunah shlema, I believe with a perfect faith, shekol ha'torah hamatzuya ata biyadenu, that this entire Torah which I have in my hands, Hi hanesuna le Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom. Okay? I believe with a perfect faith that this Torah which we have here is the same Torah which was given to Moses. No redactor. No redactor. Is our Torah the same Torah that Moses got?
Not the same exact one.
Is it the same exact Torah? If I opened up this Torah and I compared it to Moses' Torah, which was placed in the ark, would it be the same Torah?
I mean, not the same exact meaning. Like
I can guarantee you that it would not be. I can guarantee you that it would not be. And in fact, Maimonidies knew that to be the case. No, I'm talking about the written Torah. It is not the same Torah. How do we know that? Because we know that there were slight differences between different Torah scrolls that we have. Certain Torahs which have a vav in a place where others don't have a vav. Certain Torahs where a word is spelled with a hey, when other Torah scrolls place it with an aleph. The meaning doesn't change, but there are a few letter differences. Some have a he written hey yod aleph, some have it hu, hey vav aleph. We're talking a difference in 0.01% of the entire Torah, less than 1/100th of a percent of the entire Torah. That means 99.99 is the same, but 0.01% we know might be different, because we have a few different traditions.
Scriber.
What is 9?
It's the Nikud. What are you saying? Press go live.
The vowels.
It's the what?
It's the vowels mostly, like
Human error.
vav or
Okay, so it's tiny differences which don't actually make a difference. They don't technically change the meaning, but we know that to be true. Okay? Let me tell you about a very unknown piece of Torah. It comes from Tractate Sofrim. How many of you have even heard of Tractate Sofrim? Not many people have heard of Tractate Sofrim. Chapter 6, number 4, it says that when the Jews were exiled to Babylon, they took their Torahs with them. How did it work? What was the origin? Moshe wrote 12 Torahs for all the tribes, and he wrote his special Torah, which was put into the ark in the Holy Temple. And if you were a Jew and you were at home, you didn't have your own little written Torah, unless you actually wrote the entire Torah with all of its halachic requirements. Very, very difficult. So not many people had Torahs. Now you did have a thing called a Megillah Latinok, which was for children. They allowed them to write verses They allowed them to write verses down without having all the halachic requirements of exactly how you write it with a quill and all that kind of stuff. And they let them do it. That's what they had. It's called Vulgata. If you want to look it up, that's, I think, the Latin way of saying it. So they had the Torah scrolls and they had that. Now, when the Jews get exiled to Babylon, they can take a few Torahs with them, but they don't have so much. And everybody wants to learn the Torah, so everybody has their little writings with them, but it's not exact. When they come back to Israel with the return from Babylon, okay, Ezra, it says in Megillat in the Masechta Sofrim, found 3 original Torahs in the temple courtyard. Has anybody ever heard about this? Very interesting. He found 3 original Torahs. And listen to the names of the Torahs. They actually had names. Each Torah had its own name. One was called the Ma'on book. I think it's off.
Is that?
That's fine. We'll try next time. One was called the Ma'on book because the word Me'onah was written without a hey. Do you hear this? The reason it was called the Ma'on book is because one letter was different on the word Me'onah. That's how slight the differences were. Okay? Another book was called the Zatute. Don't worry about it. It's fine. We'll do it next time. The other Torah was called Zatute Torah because the word Na'arai was written in the Aramaic Zatute. That was the difference in that Torah. We're talking one word here. Not like the New Testament, which has like thousands of differences. We're talking about like a tiny thing here. And finally, there was the book of He. Sounds like a joke. It was a book where 11 times... Right, the what's it called? The
knights say
He. We are the knights that say He. Oh, Ni. This is He. This is He. This is where it came from. This is the Torah that said He. It was where the word Who, which means He, was written He. That got very confusing. The word Who, Hey Vav Aleph, was written Hey Yud Aleph, but still pronounced He. And that was the book He. It had 11 times. So Ezra went and he took the majority opinion. If he had 3 Torahs, on each word in the Torah, if there was the majority of that means 2 out of 3, he took the way the Torahs are written 2 out of 3 times. So that means there were slight differences from what we know Moshe had, strictly from the fact that there were slight differentiations that Ezra found back then. Ezra made this master Torah that all of our Torahs are based on. But the Rambam knew that there were slight differences. So there's no way that when this principle says we have the same Torah as Moses, it means exactly letter for letter. Because there are a few, like we said, 1/100th of 1% possible differentiation. Now, by the way, I saw Professor Sel Lieberman writes in a book called Hellenism in Jewish Palestine that based on Greek and Roman sources, this is how books were published in the ancient world. And this is what he writes. I'll just quote it for you. He says, the authentic original copy would be deposited in a temple, a library, or the archives. Such an act guarded the book against possible forgeries. Just like Moshe, by the way, he put his Torah inside the temple. In case of doubts or controversies regarding readings, the given book, the copy placed in the archives would be decisive. So that's really what Moshe did. He places the original Torah in the temple, and that's what gets used to decide all differences. Later on, Ezra comes back, finds 3 Torahs with slight differences, and he takes 2 out of 3. So there's no way this principle can mean literally word for word, or letter. Word for word, I wouldn't say, but letter for letter, it's the exact same Torah that Moshe got. So what does this principle mean?
The essence of it.
The essence of it? Okay, but now we're like going really far from like, it's the same Torah. We're going like, it's only conceptually the same. I wouldn't go that far. I think it's almost 99.99% the same.
Then it's the same.
Then it's the same. You're saying 99.9 is the same.
Good enough.
Closer than anything else up there.
Yes.
Really, if you look at the way that Maimonides writes this principle, he writes it differently. I want to read from you the way that Maimonides actually writes this principle. Maimonides writes, listen to this, very interesting. For those of you who've heard this your whole life, it might shock you as to what this principle actually means. You ready? Ready for your minds to be blown? Hold your heads, folks. Hold your heads. By the way, anybody know why a woodpecker doesn't get concussions? Just as an interesting,
Has a lot of cushion.
has a lot of cushioning around the brain. You know where it has cushioning around the brain? Its tongue. Why do football players get concussions but woodpeckers don't? This is the ultimate question of life. Okay, what's the answer? They found that woodpeckers have a tongue that it goes out of the mouth, of course, so they can eat whatever they eat. And then it goes inside the head and wraps around the brain, creating a natural brain helmet.
Wow.
Isn't that incredible?
Yes.
Don't you want a woodpecker tongue? No, you're not interested?
I don't want to bang my head.
You don't want to bash your brain into a tree? Just a very cool effect. All right, here is the 8th principle. And people say I don't have ADHD. Schiffer, you think, we won't discuss it. All right. Here's actually the way that the Rambam formulates principle number 8. Here's what he says. We believe that the entire Torah in our possession today was given to us by the Almighty through Moses by means of the medium we metaphorically call speech. No one knows the real nature of this communication except for Moses, to whom it was transmitted. He was a scribe receiving dictation. He wrote the history, the stories, and the commandments. Therefore, he is called the inscriber. And then I'll just skip a few lines in there. He who says that these verses and stories were invented by Moses is considered by our sages and prophets to be heretical and misleading than any other heretic. For he believes that the Torah contains both relevant, meaning given from God, and both irrelevant verses. In other words, what is the 8th principle?
The Torah is the Word of God.
That the Torah is the Word of God, and Moses did not invent any of it on his own. Meaning, even if we accept principle number 7, that Moses is a true prophet, how do we know that he didn't insert a little bit of himself into the book? How do we know he didn't add a little of his own Mosaic commentary? How do we know that he didn't, God gave him the whole book, he's like, you know what, I read this book in Reader's Digest, and, Egyptian Monthly, Hieroglyphics Daily, the Daily Palestinian, okay? And I really want to insert it. It's about this great fellow named Abraham. God tells him to kill his son. It would be a great addition, right? We can get it in post. How do we know that he didn't do that? So even if I agree that Moses is a true prophet, how do I know that he didn't insert a little bit of himself into the Torah? That is principle number 8. Principle number 8 says that the Torah we have today is completely from Hashem. Not any of it was an addition by Moshe. The way that we have it in our 13 principles doesn't sound anything like that. It sounds like our Torah is the exact same Torah as they had in the past, which I said can't be literally true. Rav Yaakov Weinberg points this out in his book, Fundamentals in Faith. There's no way it can be true because Maimonides knew that there were tiny differences. Rather, what the 8th principle represents is the idea that Moses did not insert any of his own thoughts into the Torah. And I just want to share one quick idea about this, how we know this to be true. You see, once God promises that an individual will do something according to his will, that person no longer has free will in that department. See, if God presents Moses at Sinai and vouches for him and tells the whole people, this is my man Moshe, you can trust him, he is my prophet, everything he says to you is from me. At that moment, by very definition, God removes the free will from that individual to change the Torah, to change that which God is vouching for. Even if Moshe would have wanted to do so, he couldn't have done so. Because the moment that God vouches that this is my will and that this is my prophet, by definition, he has to take away his free will of desiring or having the possibility to change the Torah. Does everybody see this? You don't see this? If God comes at... See, by the way, in general, you should know this very interesting thing. There's a Talmudic concept, a Torah concept, that God never attaches his name to the living. He'll never say the God of Yogi, for example. Never. You know why? Because even if I'm righteous at the time when God attaches his name to me, and he tells everybody I'm the God of Yogi, who knows what I'll do down the road?
Okay, I don't know if he is.
Maybe I will become a Rasha. Maybe I'll become a wicked person down the road, God forbid. And then God would have put his holy name with an unholy person. Got to be careful with who you hang out with, guys. So if God will never attach his holy name to someone until they die, because once they die, we know that they lived righteously. If God says to everybody, while Moses is living, I am giving my prophecy through him, this is my Torah. By definition, he is vouching for it. He's putting his name to this document. He's putting Bible by God. By very definition, it's his will now. And if it's his will, nobody can change God's will. Nobody has the power to overcome God's will. So what does that mean in practical? Is that he, by definition, had to take away Moses' ability to change the Torah, even if he had wanted to. I don't think he wanted to, but even if he had wanted to, he couldn't do it.
Does that work for the nation too? Does he attach his name to us as a nation?
Does he attach himself to us as a nation? Well, as a nation, we're all holy, so he can do that. But Amech Kulam Tzadikim, that's what it says. The whole nation is holy. Individually, we might have our issues. But as a nation, God could put his name to the entire nation. So that's the reason that we know that Moshe couldn't insert anything, because God would have, by definition, taken away any possibility of Moshe doing that, because he had already put his name onto the Torah. And by the way, just to add to that, the oral Torah, which was given at Sinai, has that same level of absolute nature. And again, this is what gives the Torah its absolute nature. If we were to think that Moshe could insert something, it's not absolute, and again, cannot bind us. It can bind us because we know it's absolute and cannot be compromised. And the same thing with the oral Torah, which the Torah can't live without. If you don't have an oral Torah, the Torah is basically worthless. It says put on tefillin, I have no clue what it means. It says eat these animals and slaughter them as according to the laws that I told you. You have no clue what the laws of Shechita are. Again, the Torah is worthless without the oral Torah. So again, this idea that Moshe can't change the Torah applies equally to the oral Torah. Prophets later on can't change the Torah. They can only come to admonish about it, but they can't actually change the Torah. And in fact, that gets us to our final one, which is principle number 9. Ani mamin be'emunah shlema shezos Torah lote muchlefes velote Torah acheres meis habar yisbarach shemo. I believe with the perfect faith that this Torah which we have in front of us will not be changed, cannot be, there will be no New Testament or Quran or Book of Mormon or whatever you want to say, Book of Yogi. This Torah will not be exchanged for any other Torah from Hashem. And this, of course, we have a line in the Torah, Es kol hadavar asher anochi metzav eschem oso tishmeru lasos lo tosef alav v'lo sigru mimenu. You cannot add or subtract to the Torah. This is, of course, one of the 613 commandments in the Torah. So, Elad, that's a warning. Don't be adding or subtracting to the Torah. Don't make up a new holiday or Bagel Day. Benny's Bagels Day. Everybody must buy a dozen bagels from Benny's. They must make their pilgrimage. You cannot add and you cannot subtract to the Torah, and that includes a new Torah. You cannot have a Torah that adds new laws. Like Islam adds new pilgrimages, the Hajj. Got to go to Saudi Arabia. And you cannot subtract, like Christianity, where it says it's what goes out of your mouth that's important, not which goes in, denying the laws of kashrut, and many other places where Christianity takes away the laws of the Old Testament, as they call it. Yeah?
So I just wanted to, could you elaborate on the oral Torah? Because it was written down, though, right?
The oral Torah was eventually written down because of great anti-Semitism by the Romans, and there was a fear that the Torah would be lost, the oral Torah would be lost, and therefore there's a Talmudic concept called Eis Lasos Hashem Eferes Arasecha. There's a time to act for Hashem. The Torah is going to be lost, and you're allowed to do things that even are forbidden, like write the oral Torah down in order to ensure its existence.
So how does that coexist with not adding to it?
How does that coexist tonight? Because it's a momentary change. It's a change for one point in history. Oh, you're saying because now on we're writing. So there's a special. It's not adding because if there's a special law in the Torah that says if the Torah is going to be lost, I have a special clause allowing for certain changes. That's not called a change. That's called Torah law. The Torah allows for a change if it's going to save the entirety of the Torah. Now, that's very dangerous because you could use that in a not holy way, which is why it's only been used, like, as far as I know, Eliyahu on Har Carmel did it. He made an altar outside of the temple and writing down the oral Torah. It happened maybe like twice in our entire history. One was a one-time event, and the other was the writing of the oral Torah. So it's not something which we don't use liberally at all. Yeah.
And then, so not so much that it's a change, but I'm just curious. So we also have rabbinical interpretation that makes certain things or laws or like more stringent, or they call it
right. So very good. So the other question, of course, right, is how do you have rabbinic law, which clearly adds to the Torah? The Torah says there's only a certain number of holidays. 6 holidays. You have Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Oh, is this only 5? Okay, we got 5. So you have 5 holidays. And then the rabbis come and they say, no, let's add Tisha B'Av, let's add Purim, let's add Hanukkah. Let's do washing before you eat bread. Let's make blessings before you eat instead of just after you eat. So you have different rabbinic laws. So it's a longer discussion, which I can't go too deeply because the class is running a little late. And by a little late, I mean a lot bit late. But the basic answer on one foot, the way that the commentaries explain, is that it's only a prohibition if you are saying that the Torah itself has a new law. If I say instead of there being 613 commandments, there's 614 commandments, or 612 commandments. Or I change one of the commandments. There's still 613, but I change, instead of there being 4 segments of the tefillin of the head, there's now 5 segments. Or instead of shaking 1 lulav, I shake 2 lulavs. Those would be changes. But if a rabbi comes later and he says, I'm adding a new law, but it's a rabbinic law. It's not a biblical law. I'm not changing the Torah. I'm just saying that I'm adding a rabbinic law. That's not called adding. And by the way, the Torah says, Kasher Yerucha, there's a special law that you have to listen to the rabbis of the generations because they're able to make rabbinic ordinances as time goes on. By the way, that's very important. Many commentators say that turns every rabbinic law into a biblical law, ironically, because the Torah commands us to listen to the rabbis. What's the difference between a rabbinic and a biblical? There's a certain halachic differences about if you're in cases of doubt or things like that. But otherwise, it's not a problem of adding and subtracting.
Is there a point in history to one that applied, like it still applies today, that the rabbis...
So we have a tradition that applied to the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and that slowly our wisdom dwindled with the downgrading of the generations. So we don't have the ability, the commentaries say, to enact new rabbinic laws right now. But let's leave that really on the side because that's really for a different class. I just want to finish up with principle number 9. Why is this so important to know that there will never be a Torah? And we'll finish with this idea. If a person, we know that another prophet cannot come and take away that which Moses already said. How do we know that? Because their entire credibility, we said, comes from Moses' credibility. So if they were to undermine Moses, they'd be undermining themselves. That's what it means that Moses was the father of all the prophets. Everyone else's prophecy only rests upon the prophecy in the verifiable nature of Moses' prophecy. But what would happen? You ready? Here's the question. If God came down and did another Sinai. It's true no other prophet could come and change Moses' prophecy. But certainly God could. Couldn't God come down and do another Sinai and say, now I give you a new Torah? What would happen? What would happen if that was a possibility? Do you hear the question? Even though a prophet couldn't change the Torah, because their whole credibility comes from Moses, but what if God himself could come down and give a new Torah? Have a new Sinai. Have Sinai 2.0.
There wasn't one.
What if, even though there wasn't one, like we said in the annals of history, there was only one mass revelation, but what if there lied the possibility of a new Sinai?
But it's not really like Mashiach. That's kind
So principle number 9 tells us that there does not exist that possibility of God coming down and revealing a new Torah.
They speak for God.
It's not speaking for God because all of his principles are based in Torah. It's all what the Maimonides learned from studying Torah. But understand this idea. If principle number 9 is not saying a prophet can't come down and change the Torah. We already know that because Moses is the father of all the prophets. So their prophecy is subservient to his. Of course they can't change it. This is telling us even God promises, I will not give you a new Torah. Why is this so important? Because if a Jew thought that the Torah might be changed down the road, again, it turns this Torah not into an absolute Torah. It turns into a Torah which is for a certain time and place. It's a temporary Torah. And again, not a binding Torah. And a Jew might even start to think, you know what? God really wants to give us a new Torah, an upgraded Torah, like we get on our iPhones every 2 days. The new download. He really wants to give us it. It's just the Jewish people, we're not worthy. And you know what you would think? Well, I don't know when we're going to be worthy, just like Mashiach. So I'm going to go ahead and do it for him because I know what God would want to update. And so again, if there lies the possibility that God could give us a new Torah, again, it dissolves the power of the Torah. It's no longer absolute. It's temporary. It's for a certain time and a certain place. It takes away its binding nature. And therefore, God promises us in principle number 9, I will never give you a new Torah. This Torah is the same Torah today as it will be in 2016, as it will be for all of time. And this is principle number 9. And again, with Moshe's prophecy, which is verifiable, with the fact that we said that God is absolute, he's primal, that makes God's word absolute. The Torah is absolute because it comes from Moses, who had direct prophecy, and we verified it. And it's a Torah which will never be exchanged, so it's not a temporary Torah. All of these principles create a strong bind between ourselves and the Torah. We can't get out of it. It will never be changed. It's absolute. It's verifiable. And that's why you need all these principles in order to be a good Jew. The moment you don't have them, you start fudging. You start changing. Torah doesn't become as powerful and as potent and as binding upon yourself. Linda.
Well, now I'm getting confused. So these 13 principles of faith.
Yeah.
Tell me again where they came from.
These 13 principles of Torah, Maimonides didn't make up these 13 principles. They're all principles that he deduced straight from the Torah. He deduced every one of these things. He's not making up any of these.
But it's not stated in the Torah.
It's not stated. First of all, some of it is stated explicitly, like when it talks about the unity of Hashem, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, I'm one. Okay? But there are others that are learned out from different laws in the Torah. There are others that are learned out from a clear reading of the Torah. Even if the Torah doesn't give us the principle in these words, the ideas are clearly understood to anybody who studies Torah properly.
So like that one.
So that one, of course. Yeah, Maimonides can't make up anything. He doesn't have that power. Where does he get it from? Possibly from this idea, you can't add and you can't subtract. But I think he gets it also from a number of, a clear reading of the Torah, where it says a number of times that this Torah will never be exchanged. It says that 24 times in the Torah. This Torah will never be exchanged. All right, last question, and we'll end with this. Aline.
So how does the actual coming of the Mashiach affect the status of the Torah? Because doesn't that change almost the laws of nature in a way when Mashiach comes, like the dead are going to rise, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so our tradition says even when Mashiach comes, the Torah will be the same. There is an interesting Talmudic concept that says that all the holidays will go away except for Tisha B'Av, which is fascinating. I don't know but I think there's different commentaries that say, what was that? Pesach also stays, but they say even Pesach, the new miracles are going to be greater than the old miracles, whatever it is. But however we understand that, but certainly on a simple level, the Torah never changes even in the future. There's also another Talmud that says the pig is called Chazir because it will eventually come back to us. It's got split hooves. I guess it'll start chewing its cud. So, but in general, let's leave those comments to the side. In general, the concept is the Torah will never be exchanged. What those Talmudic concepts mean either is metaphorical or as something that I'm not aware of. But that's the idea, folks. So today we went into the 4 principles that deal with the Torah, which are, again, just to summarize, what do we got here? What are the 4 principles? The middle we have all the words of the prophets are true, which we learn the idea that you need prophecy. You can't just on your own come up with understanding what God's will is. Number 2, the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu was true, and he was the father of all prophets. That means to say that since his prophecy was verified, that gives credence to all future prophets that fit into the category of what Moses defined as a true prophet. And it also tells us that a future prophet cannot undermine Moses, because of course their credibility comes from Moses. Number 8, all the Torah that we have now is the same Torah that we had back then. We said, of course, that's not exactly true because there are slight changes in a few letters. But primarily what it means to say is that Moses did not insert any of his own thoughts into the Torah. And the reason is because God took away his free will at the moment that he attached his name to him. And finally, number 9, this Torah will never be exchanged. God makes a promise to us. This Torah is not temporal. It is absolute for all times. There will be no New Testament. There will only the old one, the original, which we don't even call old. We just call the Torah. So we'll stop there. Have a great night, everybody.